Chomsky, one of the leading anti-war intellectuals during the Vietnam period, looked in mid-1978 at how the history of the war was being presented in the major media, and wrote that they were destroying the historical record and supplanting it with a more comfortable story, reducing lessons of the war to the socially neutral categories of error, ignorance, and cost. The Carter administration clearly was trying to end the disillusionment of the American people after the Vietnam War by following foreign policies more palatable, less obviously aggressive. Hence, the emphasis on human rights, the pressure on South Africa and Chile to liberalize their policies. But on close examination, these more liberal policies were designed to leave intact the power and influence of the American military and American business in the world. The renegotiation of the Panama Canal Treaty with the Chinese Central American Republic of Panama was an example. The canal saved American companies $1.5 billion a year in delivery costs, and the United States collected $150 million a year in tolls, out of which it paid the Panama government $2.3 million, while maintaining 14 military bases in the area. Back in 1903, the United States had engineered a revolution against Colombia, set up the new tiny Republic of Panama in Central America, and dictated a treaty giving the United States military bases control of the Panama Canal and sovereignty in perpetuity. The Carter administration in 1977, responding to the anti-American protests in Panama, decided to renegotiate the treaty. The New York Times was candid about the canal. We stole it and removed the incriminating evidence from our history books. By 1977, the canal had lost military importance. It could not accommodate large tankers or aircraft carriers. That, plus the anti-American riots in Panama, led the Carter administration, over conservative opposition, to negotiate a new treaty which called for a gradual removal of U.S. bases, which could easily be relocated elsewhere in the area. The canal's legal ownership would be turned over to Panama after a period. The treaty also contained vague language which could be the basis for American military intervention under certain conditions. Whatever Carter's sophistication in foreign policy, certain fundamentals operated in the late 60s and the 70s. American corporations were active all over the world on a scale never seen before. There were, by the early 70s, about 300 U.S. corporations, including the 7 largest banks, which earned 40% of their net profits outside the United States. They were called multinationals, but actually 98% of their top executives were American. As a group, they now constituted the 3rd largest economy in the world, next to the United States and the Soviet Union. The relationship of these global corporations with the poorer countries had long been an exploiting one. It was clear from U.S. Department of Commerce figures. Whereas U.S. corporations in Europe between 1950 and 1965 invested $8.1 billion and made $5.5 billion in profits in Latin America, they invested $3.8 billion and made $11.2 billion in profits. And in Africa, they invested $5.2 billion and made $14.3 billion in profits. It was the classical imperial situation, where the places with natural wealth became victims of more powerful nations, whose power came from that sea's wealth. American corporations depended on the poorer countries for 100% of their diamonds, coffee, platinum, mercury, natural rubber, and cobalt. They got 90% of their manganese from abroad, 90% of their chrome and aluminum, and 20 to 40% of certain imports, platinum, mercury, cobalt, chrome, manganese, came from Africa. Another fundamental of foreign policy, whether Democrats or Republicans were in the White House, was the training of foreign military officers. The Army had a School of the Americas in the Canal Zone, from which thousands of military leaders in Latin America had graduated. 6 of the graduates, for instance, were in the Chilean military junta that overthrew the democratically elected Allende government in 1973. The American commandant of the school told a reporter, "We keep in touch with our graduates, and they keep in touch with us." And yet, the United States cultivated a reputation for being generous with its riches. Indeed, it had frequently given aid to disaster victims. This aid, however, often depended on political loyalty. In one 6-year drought in West Africa, 100,000 Africans died of starvation. A report by the Carnegie Endowment said the Agency for International Development, AID, of the United States had been inefficient and neglectful in giving aid to nomads in the Sahel area of West Africa, an area covering 6 countries. The response of AID was that those countries had no close historical, economic, or political ties to the United States. In early 1975, the press carried a dispatch from Washington. Secretary of State Henry A. Kissinger has formally initiated a policy of selecting for cutbacks in American aid those nations that have sided against the U.S. in votes in the United Nations. In some cases, the cutbacks involve food and humanitarian relief. Most aid was openly military, and by 1975, the United States exported $9.5 billion in arms. The Carter administration promised to end the sale of arms to repressive regimes, but when it took office, the bulk of the sales continued. And the military continued to take a huge share of the national budget. When Carter was running for election, he told the Democratic Platform Committee, "Without endangering the defense of our nation or commitments to our allies, we can reduce present defense expenditures by about $5 to $7 billion annually." But his first budget proposed not a decrease, but an increase of $10 billion for the military. Indeed, he proposed that the U.S. spend $1,000 billion, $1 trillion, in the next 5 years on its military forces. And the administration had just announced that the Department of Agriculture would save $25 million a year by no longer giving free second helpings of milk to 1.4 million needy school children who got free meals in school. If Carter's job was to restore faith in the system, here was his greatest failure: solving the economic problems of the people. The price of food and the necessities of life continued to rise faster than wages were rising. Unemployment remained officially at 6 or 8%. Unofficially, the rates were higher. For certain key groups in the population, young people and especially black people, the unemployment rate was 20 or 30%. It soon became clear that blacks in the United States, the group most in support of Carter for president, were bitterly disappointed with his policies. He opposed federal aid to poor people who needed abortions, and when it was pointed out to him that this was unfair because rich women could get abortions with ease, he replied, "Well, as you know, there are many things in life that are not fair, that wealthy people can afford and poor people cannot." Carter's populism was not visible in his administration's relationship to the oil and gas interests. It was part of Carter's energy plan to end price regulation of natural gas for the consumer. The largest producer of natural gas was Exxon Corporation, and the largest blocks of private stock in Exxon were owned by the Rockefeller family. Early in Carter's administration, the Federal Energy Administration found that Gulf Oil Corporation had overstated by $79.1 million its costs for crude oil obtained from foreign affiliates. It then passed on those false costs to consumers. In the summer of 1978, the administration announced that a compromise had been made with Gulf Oil in which Gulf agreed to pay back $42.2 million. Gulf informed its stockholders that the payments will not affect earnings since adequate provision was made in prior years. The lawyer for the Energy Department who worked out the compromise with Gulf said it had been done to avoid a lengthy and costly lawsuit. Would the lawsuit have cost the $36.9 million dropped in the compromise? Would the government have considered letting off a bank robber without a jail term in return for half the loot? The settlement was a perfect example of what Carter had told a meeting of lawyers during his presidential campaign, that the law was on the side of the rich. The fundamental facts of maldistribution of wealth in America were clearly not going to be affected by Carter's policies any more than by previous administrations, whether conservative or liberal. According to Andrew Zimbalist, an American economist writing in Le Monde Diplomatique in 1977, the top 10% of the American population had an income 30 times that of the bottom tenth. The top 1% of the nation owned 33% of the wealth. The richest 5% owned 83% of the personally owned corporate stock. The 100 largest corporations, despite the graduated income tax that misled people into thinking the very rich paid at least 50% in taxes, paid an average of 26.9% in taxes, and the leading oil companies paid 5.8% in taxes. Internal Revenue Service figures for 1974. Indeed, 244 individuals who earned over $200,000 paid no taxes. In 1979, as Carter weekly proposed benefits for the poor, and Congress strongly turned them down, a black woman, Marian Wright Edelman, director of the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, pointed to some facts. 1 of every 7 American children, 10 million altogether, had no known regular source of primary health care. 1 of every 3 children under 17, 18 million altogether, had never seen a dentist. In an article on the New York Times op-ed page, she wrote, "The Senate Budget Committee recently knocked off $88 million from a modest $288 million administration request to improve the program that screens and treats children's health problems. At the same time, the Senate found $725 million to bail out Litton Industries and to hand to the Navy at least 2 destroyers ordered by the Shah of Iran." Carter approved tax reforms which benefited mainly the corporations. Economist Robert Lay-Catchman, writing in The Nation, noted the sharp increase in corporate profits, 44%, in the last quarter of 1978 over the previous year's last quarter. He wrote, "Perhaps the president's most outrageous act occurred last November when he signed into law an $18 billion tax reduction, the bulk of whose benefits accrue to affluent individuals and corporations. In 1979, while the poor were taking cuts, the salary of the chairman of Exxon Oil was being raised to $830,000 a year, and that of the chairman of Mobil Oil to over $1 million a year. That year, while Exxon's net income rose 56% to more than $4 billion, 3,000 small independent gasoline stations went out of business." Carter made some efforts to hold on to social programs, but this was undermined by his very large military budgets. Presumably, this was to guard against the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Carter could take only symbolic actions, like reinstituting the draft or calling for a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. On the other hand, American weaponry was used to support dictatorial regimes battling left-wing rebels abroad. A report by the Carter administration to Congress in 1977 was blunt, saying that a number of countries with deplorable records of human rights observance are also countries where we have important security and foreign policy interests. Thus, Carter asked Congress in the spring of 1980 for $5.7 million in credits for the military junta fighting off a peasant rebellion in El Salvador. In the Philippines, after the 1978 National Assembly elections, President Ferdinand Marcos imprisoned 10 of the 21 losing opposition candidates. Many prisoners were tortured. Many civilians were killed. Still, Carter urged Congress to give Marcos $300 million in military aid for the next 5 years. In Nicaragua, the United States had helped maintain the Somoza dictatorship for decades. Misreading the basic weakness of that regime and the popularity of the revolution against it, The Carter administration continued its support for Somoza until close to the regime's fall in 1979. In Iran, toward the end of 1978, the long years of resentment against the Shah's dictatorship culminated in mass demonstrations. On September 8, 1978, hundreds of demonstrators were massacred by the Shah's troops. The next day, according to a UPI dispatch from Tehran, Carter affirmed his support for the Shah. Troops opened fire on demonstrators against the Shah for the third straight day yesterday, and President Jimmy Carter telephoned the Royal Palace to express support for Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who faced the worst crisis of his 37-year reign. 9 members of parliament walked out on a speech by Iran's new premier, shouting that his hands were stained with blood in the crackdown on conservative Muslims and other protesters. On December 13, 1978, Nicholas Gage reported for the New York Times. The staff of the United States Embassy here has been bolstered by dozens of specialists flown in to back an effort to help the Shah against a growing challenge to his rule, according to embassy sources. The new arrivals, according to the embassy sources, include a number of Central Intelligence Agency specialists on Iran, in addition to diplomats and military personnel. In early 1979, as the crisis in Iran was intensifying, the former chief analyst on Iran for the CIA told New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh that he and his colleagues knew of the tortures of Iranian dissenters by Savaki, the Iranian secret police set up during the late 1950s by the Shah with help from the CIA. Furthermore, he told Hersh that a senior CIA official was involved in instructing officials in Savaki on torture techniques. It was a popular, massive revolution, and the Shah fled. The Carter administration later accepted him into the country, presumably for medical treatment, and the anti-American feelings of the revolutionaries reached a high point. On November 4, 1979, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was taken over by student militants who, demanding that the Shah be returned to Iran for punishment, held 52 embassy employees hostage. For the next 14 months, with the hostages still held in the embassy compound, that issue took the forefront of foreign news in the United States and aroused powerful nationalist feelings. When Carter ordered the Immigration and Naturalization Service to start deportation proceedings against Iranian students who lacked valid visas, the New York Times gave cautious but clear approval. Politicians and the press played into a general hysteria. An Iranian-American girl who was slated to give a high school commencement address was removed from the program. The bumper sticker, "Bomb Iran," appeared on autos all over the country. It was a rare journalist bold enough to point out, as Alan Richman of the Boston Globe did, when the 52 hostages were released alive and apparently well, that there was a certain lack of proportion in American reactions to this and other violations of human rights. There were 52 of them, a number easy to comprehend. It wasn't like the 15,000 innocent people permanently disappearing in Argentina. They, the American hostages, spoke our language. There were 3,000 people summarily shot in Guatemala last year who did not. The hostages were still in captivity when Jimmy Carter faced Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. That fact and the economic distress felt by many were largely responsible for Carter's defeat. Reagan's victory, followed 8 years later by the election of George Bush, meant that another part of the establishment, lacking even the faint liberalism of the Carter presidency, would be in charge. The policies would be more crass, cutting benefits to poor people, lowering taxes for the wealthy, increasing the military budget, filling the federal court system with conservative judges, actively working to destroy revolutionary movements in the Caribbean. The dozen years of the Reagan-Bush presidency transformed the federal judiciary, never more than moderately liberal, into a predominantly conservative institution. By the fall of 1991, Reagan and Bush had filled more than half of the 837 federal judgeships and appointed enough right-wing justices to transform the Supreme Court. In the 70s, with liberal justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall in the lead, the court had declared death penalties unconstitutional, had supported in Roe v. Wade the right of women to choose abortions, and had interpreted the civil rights law as permitting special attention to blacks and women to make up for past discrimination, affirmative action. William Rehnquist, first named to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, was made Chief Justice by Ronald Reagan. In the Reagan-Bush years, the Rehnquist court made a series of decisions that weakened Roe v. Wade, brought back the death penalty, reduced the rights of detainees against police powers, prevented doctors and federally supported family planning clinics from giving women information on abortions, and said that poor people could be forced to pay for public education. Education was not a fundamental right. Justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall were the last of the court's liberals. Old and ill, though reluctant to give up the fight, they retired. The final act to create a conservative Supreme Court was President Bush's nomination to replace Marshall. He chose a black conservative, Clarence Thomas. Despite dramatic testimony from a former colleague, a young black law professor named Anita Hill, that Thomas had sexually harassed her, Thomas was approved by the Senate, and now the Supreme Court moved even more decisively to the right. With conservative federal judges, with pro-business appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, judicial decisions and board findings weakened a labor movement already troubled by a decline in manufacturing. Workers who went out on strike found themselves with no legal protection. One of the first acts of the Reagan administration was to dismiss from their jobs, en masse, striking air traffic controllers. It was a warning to future strikers and a sign of the weakness of a labor movement which in the 30s and 40s had been a powerful force. Corporate America became the greatest beneficiary of the Reagan-Bush years. In the 60s and 70s, an important environmental movement had grown in the nation, horrified at the poisoning of the air, the seas and rivers, and the deaths of thousands each year as a result of work conditions. After a mine explosion in West Virginia killed 78 miners in November 1968, there had been angry protests in the mine district, and Congress passed the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969. Nixon's Secretary of Labor spoke of a new national passion for environmental improvement. The following year, yielding to strong demands from the labor movement and consumer groups, but also seeing it as an opportunity to win the support of working-class voters, President Nixon had signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. This was an important piece of legislation, establishing a universal right to a safe and healthy workplace, and creating an enforcement machinery. Reflecting on this years later, Herbert Stein, who had been the chairman of Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors, lamented that the juggernaut of environmental regulation proved not to be controllable by the Nixon administration. While President Jimmy Carter came into office praising the OSHA program, he was also eager to please the business community. The woman he appointed to head OSHA, Eula Bingham, fought for strong enforcement of the act and was occasionally successful. But as the American economy showed signs of trouble, with oil prices, inflation, and unemployment rising, Carter seemed more and more concerned about the difficulties the act created for business. He became an advocate of removing regulations on corporations and giving them more leeway, even if this was hurtful to labor and to consumers. Environmental regulation became more and more a victim of cost-benefit analysis, in which regulations protecting the health and safety of the public became secondary to how costly this would be for business. Under Reagan and Bush, this concern for the economy, which was a shorthand term for corporate profit, dominated any concern for workers or consumers. President Reagan proposed to replace tough enforcement of environmental laws by a voluntary approach, leaving it to businesses to decide for themselves what they would do. He appointed as head of OSHA a businessman who was hostile to OSHA's aims. One of his first acts was to order the destruction of 100,000 government booklets pointing out the dangers of cotton dust to textile workers. Political scientist William Grover, the president as prisoner, evaluating environmental policy under Carter and Reagan as part of his penetrating structural critique of both presidents, concluded, OSHA appears caught in a cycle of liberal presidents who want to retain some health and safety regulatory programs, but who also need economic growth for political survival, and conservative presidents who focus almost exclusively on the growth side of the equation. Such a cycle will always tend to subordinate the need for safe and healthful workplaces to ensuring that commitment to OSHA will only be as strong as the priorities of business will allow. George Bush presented himself as the environmental president and pointed with pride to his signing of the Clean Air Act of 1990. But 2 years after that act was passed, it was seriously weakened by a new rule of the Environmental Protection Agency that allowed manufacturers to increase by 245 tons a year hazardous pollutants in the atmosphere. Furthermore, little money was allocated for enforcement. Contaminated drinking water had caused over 100,000 illnesses between 1971 and 1985, according to an EPA report. But in Bush's first year in office, while the EPA received 80,000 complaints of contaminated drinking water, only 1 in 100 was investigated. And in 1991 and 1992, according to a private environmental group, the National Resources Defense Council, there were some 250,000 violations of the Safe Water Drinking Act, which had been passed during the Nixon administration. Shortly after Bush took office, a government scientist prepared testimony for a congressional committee on the dangerous effects of industrial uses of coal and other fossil fuels in contributing to global warming, a depletion of the Earth's protective ozone layer. The White House changed the testimony over the scientist's objections to minimize the danger. Boston Globe, October 29, 1990. Again, business worries about regulation seem to override the safety of the public. The ecological crisis in the world had become so obviously serious that Pope John Paul II felt the need to rebuke the wealthy classes of the industrialized nations for creating that crisis. Today, the dramatic threat of ecological breakdown is teaching us the extent to which greed and selfishness, both individual and collective, are contrary to the order of creation. At international conferences to deal with the perils of global warming, the European community and Japan proposed specific levels and timetables for carbon dioxide emissions, in which the United States was the leading culprit. But, as the New York Times reported in the summer of 1991, the Bush administration fears that it would hurt the nation's economy in the short term for no demonstrable long-term climatic benefit. Scientific opinion was quite clear on the long-term benefit, but this was not as important as the economy, that is, the needs of corporations. Evidence became stronger by the late 80s that renewable energy sources, water, wind, sunlight, could produce more usable energy than nuclear plants, which were dangerous and expensive, and produced radioactive wastes that could not be safely disposed of. Yet, the Reagan and Bush administrations made deep cuts, under Reagan a 90% cut, in research into renewable energy possibilities. In June 1992, more than 100 countries participated in the Earth Summit Environmental Conference in Brazil. Statistics showed that the armed forces of the world were responsible for 2/3 of the gases that depleted the ozone layer. But when it was suggested that the Earth Summit consider the effects of the military on environmental degradation, the United States delegation objected, and the suggestion was defeated. Indeed, the preservation of a huge military establishment and the retention of profit levels of oil corporations appeared to be twin objectives of the Reagan-Bush administrations. Shortly after Ronald Reagan took office, 23 oil industry executives contributed $270,000 to redecorate the White House living quarters, according to the Associated Press. The solicitation drive came 4 weeks after the president decontrolled oil prices, a decision worth $2 billion to the oil industry. Jack Hodges of Oklahoma City, owner of Core Oil and Gas Company, said, The top man of this country ought to live in one of the top places. Mr. Reagan has helped the energy business. While he built up the military, allocations of over $1 trillion in his first 4 years in office, Reagan tried to pay for this with cuts in benefits for the poor. There would be $140 billion of cuts in social programs through 1984, and an increase of $181 billion for defense in the same period. He also proposed tax cuts of $190 billion, most of this going to the wealthy. Despite the tax cuts and the military appropriations, Reagan insisted he would still balance the budget because the tax cuts would so stimulate the economy as to generate new revenue. Nobel Prize-winning economist Wassily Leontief remarked dryly, "This is not likely to happen. In fact, I personally guarantee that it will not happen." Indeed, Department of Commerce figures showed that periods of lowered corporate taxes, 1973 to 1975, 1979 to 1982, did not at all show higher capital investment, but a steep drop. The sharpest rise of capital investment, 1975 to 1979, took place when corporate taxes were slightly higher than they had been the preceding 5 years. The human consequences of Reagan's budget cuts went deep. For instance, Social Security disability benefits were terminated for 350,000 people. A man injured in an oil field accident was forced to go back to work, the federal government overruling both the company doctor and a state supervisor who testified that he was too disabled to work. The man died, and federal officials said, "We have a PR problem." A war hero of Vietnam, Roy Benavidez, who had been presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor by Reagan, was told by Social Security officials that the shrapnel pieces in his heart, arms, and leg did not prevent him from working. Appearing before a congressional committee, he denounced Reagan. Unemployment grew in the Reagan years. In the year 1982, 30 million people were unemployed all or part of the year. One result was that over 16 million Americans lost medical insurance, which was often tied to holding a job. In Michigan, where the unemployment rate was the highest in the country, the infant death rate began to rise in 1981. New requirements eliminated free school lunches for more than 1 million poor children who depended on the meal for as much as half of their daily nutrition. Millions of children entered the ranks of the officially declared poor, and soon a quarter of the nation's children, 12 million, were living in poverty. In parts of Detroit, 1/3 of the children were dying before their first birthday, and the New York Times commented, "Given what's happening to the hungry in America, this administration has cause only for shame." Welfare became an object of attack. Aid to single mothers with children through the AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, food stamps, health care for the poor through Medicaid. For most people on welfare, the benefits differed from state to state. This meant $500 to $700 a month in aid, leaving them well below the poverty level of about $900 a month. Black children were 4 times as likely as white children to grow up on welfare. Early in the Reagan administration, responding to the argument that government aid was not needed, that private enterprise would take care of poverty, a mother wrote to her local newspaper, "I am on Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and both my children are in school. I have graduated from college with distinction, 128th in a class of over 1,000, with a BA in English and sociology. I have experience in library work, childcare, social work, and counseling. I have been to the CETA office. They have nothing for me. I also go every week to the library to scour the newspaper help wanted ads. I have kept a copy of every cover letter that I have sent out with my resume. The stack is inches thick. I have applied for jobs paying as little as $8,000 a year. I work part-time in a library for $3.50 an hour. Welfare reduces my allotment to compensate. It appears we have employment offices that can't employ, governments that can't govern, and an economic system that can't produce jobs for people ready to work. Last week I sold my bed to pay for the insurance on my car. which in the absence of mass transportation, I need to go job hunting. I sleep on a piece of rubber foam somebody gave me. So this is the great American dream my parents came to this country for. Work hard, get a good education, follow the rules, and you will be rich. I don't want to be rich. I just want to be able to feed my children and live with some semblance of dignity. Democrats often joined Republicans in denouncing welfare programs. Presumably, this was done to gain political support from a middle-class public that believed they were paying taxes to support teenage mothers and people they thought too lazy to work. Much of the public did not know and were not informed by either political leaders or the media that welfare took a tiny part of the taxes and military spending took a huge chunk of it. Yet, the public's attitude on welfare was different from that of the two major parties. It seemed that the constant attacks on welfare by politicians reported endlessly in the press and on television did not succeed in eradicating a fundamental generosity felt by most Americans. A New York Times CBS News poll conducted in early 1992 showed that public opinion on welfare changed depending on how the question was worded. If the word welfare was used, 44% of those questioned said that too much was being spent on welfare, while 50% said that either the right amount was being spent or that too little was being spent. But when the question was about assistance to the poor, only 13% thought too much was being spent, and 64% thought too little was being spent. This suggested that both parties were trying to manufacture an anti-human needs mood by constant derogatory use of the word welfare, and then to claim they were acting in response to public opinion. The Democrats, as well as the Republicans, had strong connections to wealthy corporations. Kevin Phillips, a Republican analyst of national politics, wrote in 1990 that the Democratic Party was history's second most enthusiastic capitalist party. Phillips pointed out that the greatest beneficiaries of government policy during the Republican presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George Bush were the super rich. It was the truly wealthy, more than anyone else, who flourished under Reagan. The 1980s were the triumph of Upper America, the political ascendancy of the rich, and a glorification of capitalism, free markets, and finance. When government policy enriched the already rich, it was not called welfare. This was not as obvious as the monthly checks to the poor. It most often took the form of generous changes in the tax system. In America, Who Really Pays the Taxes? Two investigative reporters with the Philadelphia Inquirer, Donald Bartlett and James Steele, traced the path by which tax rates for the very rich got lower and lower. It was not the Republicans, but the Democrats, the Kennedy-Johnson administrations, who, under the guise of tax reform, first lowered the World War II era rate of 91% on incomes over $400,000 a year to 70%. During the Carter administration, though over his objections, Democrats and Republicans in Congress joined to give even more tax breaks to the rich. The Reagan administration, with the help of Democrats in Congress, lowered the tax rate on the very rich to 50%, and in 1986, a coalition of Republicans and Democrats sponsored another tax reform bill that lowered the top rate to 28%. Bartlett and Steele noted that a school teacher, a factory worker, and a billionaire could all pay 28%. The idea of a progressive income in which the rich paid at higher rates than everyone else was now almost dead. As a result of all the tax bills from 1978 to 1990, the net worth of the Forbes 400, chosen as the richest in the country by Forbes magazine, advertising itself as capitalist tool, was tripled. About $70 billion a year was lost in government revenue, so that in those 13 years, the wealthiest 1% of the country gained $1 trillion. As William Greider pointed out in his remarkable book, Who Will Tell the People? The Betrayal of American Democracy, for those who blame Republicans for what has happened and believe that equitable taxation will be restored if only the Democrats can win back the White House, there is this disquieting fact. The turning point on tax politics, when the moneyed elites first began to win big, occurred in 1978, with the Democratic Party fully in power and well before Ronald Reagan came to Washington. Democratic majorities have supported this great shift in tax burden every step of the way. Not only did the income tax become less progressive during the last decades of the century, but the Social Security tax became more regressive. That is, more and more was deducted from the salary checks of the poor and middle classes, but when salaries reached $42,000, no more was deducted. By the early 1990s, a middle-income family earning $37,800 a year paid 7.65% of its income in Social Security taxes. A family earning 10 times as much, $378,000, paid 1.46% of its income in Social Security taxes. The result of these higher payroll taxes was that 3/4 of all wage earners paid more each year through the Social Security tax than through the income tax. Embarrassingly for the Democratic Party, which was supposed to be the party of the working class, those higher payroll taxes had been put in motion under the administration of Jimmy Carter. In a two-party system, if both parties ignore public opinion, there is no place voters can turn. And in the matter of taxation, it has been clear that American citizens have wanted taxes that are truly progressive. William Greider informs us that shortly after World War II, when rates on the very rich were up to 90%, a Gallup poll showed that 85% of the public thought the federal tax code was fair. But by 1984, when all those tax reforms had been put into effect by Democrats and Republicans, a public opinion survey by the Internal Revenue Service found that 80% of those polled agreed with the statement, "The present tax system benefits the rich and is unfair to the ordinary working man and woman." By the end of the Reagan years, the gap between rich and poor in the United States had grown dramatically, where in 1980, the chief executive officers, CEOs of corporations made 40 times as much in salary as the average factory worker. By 1989, they were making 93 times as much. In the dozen years from 1977 to 1989, the before-tax income of the richest 1% rose 77%. Meanwhile, for the poorest 2/5 of the population, there was no gain at all, indeed a small decline. And because of favorable changes for the rich in the tax structure, the richest 1% in the decade ending in 1990 saw their after-tax income increase 87%. In the same period, the after-tax income of the lower 4/5 of the population either went down 5% at the poorest level or went up no more than 8.6%. While everybody at the lower levels was doing worse, there were especially heavy losses for blacks, Hispanics, women, and the young. The general impoverishment of the lowest income groups that took place in the Reagan-Bush years hit black families hardest, with their lack of resources to start with, and with racial discrimination facing them in jobs. The victories of the civil rights movement had opened up spaces for some African Americans, but left others far behind. At the end of the 80s, at least a third of African American families fell below the official poverty level, and black unemployment seemed fixed at 2.5 times that of whites, with young blacks out of work at the rate of 30 to 40%. The life expectancy of blacks remained at least 10 years lower than that of whites. In Detroit, Washington, and Baltimore, the mortality rate for black babies was higher than in Jamaica or Costa Rica. Along with poverty came broken homes, family violence, street crime, drugs. In Washington, D.C., with a concentrated population of black poor within walking distance of the marble buildings of the national government, 42% of young black men between the ages of 18 and 35 were either in jail or out on probation or parole. The crime rate among blacks, instead of being seen as a crying demand for the elimination of poverty, was used by politicians to call for the building of more prisons. The 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education had begun the process of desegregating schools. But poverty kept black children in ghettos, and many schools around the country remained segregated by race and class. Supreme Court decisions in the 70s determined that there need be no equalization of funds for poor school districts and rich school districts, San Antonio Independent School District v. Rodriguez, and that the busing of children need not take place between wealthy suburbs and inner cities, Milliken v. Bradley. To admirers of free enterprise and laissez-faire, those people were poor who did not work and produce, and so had themselves to blame for their poverty. They ignored the fact that women taking care of children on their own were working very hard indeed. They did not ask why babies who were not old enough to show their work skills should be penalized to the point of death for growing up in a poor family. Ironically, it was Republican Kevin Phillips who, analyzing the Reagan years, wrote, "Less and less wealth was going to people who produced something. Disproportionate rewards to society's economic, legal, and cultural manipulators, from lawyers to financial advisors." In the mid-'80s, a major scandal began to emerge in Washington. The deregulation of the savings and loan banks begun in the Carter administration had continued under Reagan, leading to risky investments which drained the assets of the banks, leaving them owing billions of dollars to depositors which the government had insured. As the years went by and the problem was kept behind the screen, it was going to take more and more money to pay depositors and bail out these banks. The figure began to reach $200 billion. During the 1988 presidential campaign, the Democratic candidate, Michael Dukakis, was restrained from pointing the finger at the Republican administration because the Democrats in Congress were heavily involved in bringing about and then covering up the situation. So the voters were kept in the dark. The enormous drain of money from the Treasury for defense had once been declared by President Eisenhower to be a theft from human needs, but it was accepted by both parties as Democrats competed with Republicans to show the electorate how tough they were. Jimmy Carter, as president, had proposed a $10 billion increase in the military budget, an enactment of exactly what Eisenhower had described. All of the huge military budgets of the post-World War II period, from Truman to Reagan and Bush, were approved overwhelmingly by both Democrats and Republicans. The spending of trillions of dollars to build up nuclear and non-nuclear forces was justified by fears that the United States, also building up its military forces, would invade Western Europe. But George Kennan, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union and one of the theoreticians of the Cold War, said this fear had no basis in reality. And Harry Rositzky, who worked for the CIA for 25 years and was at one time CIA director of espionage operations against the Soviet Union, wrote in the 1980s, "In all of my years in government and since, I have never seen an intelligence estimate that shows how it would be profitable to Soviet interests to invade Western Europe or to attack the United States." However, the creation of such a fear in the public mind was useful in arguing for the building of frightful and superfluous weapons. For instance, the Trident submarine, which was capable of firing hundreds of nuclear warheads, cost $1.5 billion. It was totally useless except in a nuclear war, in which case it would only add several hundred warheads to the tens of thousands already available. That $1.5 billion was enough to finance a 5-year program of child immunization around the world against deadly diseases and prevent 5 million deaths. Ruth Sivert, World Military and Social Expenditures, 1987 to 1988. In the mid-1980s, an analyst with the RAND Corporation, which did research for the Defense Department, told an interviewer in an unusually candid statement that the enormous number of weapons was unnecessary from a military point of view, but were useful to convey a certain image at home and abroad. If you had a strong president, a strong Secretary of Defense, they could temporarily go to Congress and say, "We're only going to build what we need, and if the Russians build twice as many, tough." But it would be unstable politically, and it is therefore better for our own domestic stability as well as international perceptions to insist that we remain good competitors, even though the objective significance of the competition is dubious. In 1984, the CIA admitted that it had exaggerated Soviet military expenditures, that since 1975 it had claimed Soviet military spending was growing by 4 to 5% each year, when the actual figure was 2%. Thus, by misinformation, even deception, the result was to inflate military expenditures. One of the favorite military programs of the Reagan administration was the Star Wars program, in which billions were spent, supposedly to build a shield in space to stop enemy nuclear missiles in midair. But the first 3 tests of the technology failed. A 4th test was undertaken with government funding for the program at stake. There was another failure, but Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, approved the faking of results to show that the test had succeeded. When the Soviet Union began to disintegrate in 1989, and there was no longer the familiar Soviet threat, the military budget was reduced somewhat, but still remained huge, with support from both Democrats and Republicans. In 1992, the head of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin, a Democrat, proposed, in view of the new international situation, that the military budget be cut by 2%, from $281 billion to $275 billion. That same year, as Democrats and Republicans both supported minor cuts in the military budget, a public opinion survey done for the National Press Club showed that 59% of American voters wanted a 50% cut in defense spending over the next 5 years. It seemed that both parties had failed in persuading the citizenry that the military budget should continue at its high level, but they continued to ignore the public they were supposed to represent. In the summer of 1992, congressional Democrats and Republicans joined to vote against a transfer of funds from the military budget to human needs, and voted to spend $120 billion to defend Europe, which everyone acknowledged was no longer in danger, if it had ever been, from Soviet attack. Democrats and Republicans had long been joined in a bipartisan foreign policy, but in the Reagan-Bush years, the United States government showed a special aggressiveness in the use of military force abroad. This was done either directly in invasions or through both overt and covert support of right-wing tyrannies that cooperated with the United States. Reagan came into office just after a revolution had taken place in Nicaragua, in which a popular Sandinista movement, named after the 1920s revolutionary hero Augusto Sandino, overthrew the corrupt Somoza dynasty, long supported by the United States. The Sandinistas, a coalition of Marxists, left-wing priests, and assorted nationalists, set about to give more land to the peasants and to spread education and health care among the poor. The Reagan administration, seeing in this a communist threat, but even more important, a challenge to the long U.S. control over governments in Central America, began immediately to work to overthrow the Sandinista government. It waged a secret war by having the CIA organize a counter-revolutionary force, the Contras, many of whose leaders were former leaders of the hated National Guard under Somoza. The Contras seemed to have no popular support inside Nicaragua, and so were based next door in Honduras, a very poor country dominated by the United States. From Honduras, they moved across the border, raiding farms and villages, killing men, women, and children, committing atrocities. A former colonel with the Contras, Edgar Chamorro, testified before the World Court. We were told that the only way to defeat the Sandinistas was to use the tactics the agency, the CIA, attributed to communist insurgencies elsewhere: kill, kidnap, rob, and torture. Many civilians were killed in cold blood. Many others were tortured, mutilated, raped, robbed, or otherwise abused. When I agreed to join, I had hoped that it would be an organization of Nicaraguans. It turned out to be an instrument of the U.S. government. There was a reason for the secrecy of the U.S. actions in Nicaragua. Public opinion surveys showed that the American public was opposed to military involvement there. In 1984, the CIA, using Latin American agents to conceal its involvement, put mines in the harbors of Nicaragua to blow up ships. When information leaked out, Secretary of Defense Weinberger told ABC News, "The United States is not mining the harbors of Nicaragua." Later that year, Congress, responding perhaps to public opinion in the memory of Vietnam, made it illegal for the United States to support, directly or indirectly, military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration decided to ignore this law and to find ways to fund the Contras secretly, looking for third-party support. Reagan himself solicited funds from Saudi Arabia, at least $32 million. The friendly dictatorship in Guatemala was used to get arms surreptitiously to the Contras. Israel, dependent on U.S. aid and always dependable for support, was also used. In 1986, a story appearing in a Beirut magazine created a sensation. That weapons had been sold by the United States to Iran, supposedly an enemy. That in return, Iran had promised to release hostages being held by extremist Muslims in Lebanon, and that profits from the sale were being given to the Contras to buy arms. When asked about this at a press conference in November 1986, President Reagan told 4 lies. That the shipment to Iran consisted of a few token anti-tank missiles, in fact, 2,000. That the United States didn't condone shipments by third parties, that weapons had not been traded for hostages, and that the purpose of the operation was to promote a dialogue with Iranian moderates. In reality, the purpose was a double one, to free hostages and get credit for that, and to help the Contras. The previous month, when a transport plane that had carried arms to the Contras was downed by Nicaraguan gunfire, and the American pilot captured, the lies had multiplied. Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams lied. Secretary of State Shultz lied. No connection with the U.S. government at all. Evidence mounted that the captured pilot was working for the CIA. The whole Iran-Contra affair became a perfect example of the double line of defense of the American establishment. The first defense is to deny the truth. If exposed, the second defense is to investigate, but not too much. The press will publicize, but they will not get to the heart of the matter. Once the scandal was out in the open, neither the congressional investigating committees, nor the press, nor the trial of Colonel Oliver North, who oversaw the Contra aid operation, got to the critical questions. What is U.S. foreign policy all about? How are the president and his staff permitted to support a terrorist group in Central America to overthrow a government that, whatever its faults, is welcomed by its own people as a great improvement over the terrible governments the U.S. has supported there for years? What does the scandal tell us about democracy, about freedom of expression, about an open society? Out of the much-publicized Contragate scandal came no powerful critique of secrecy in government or of the erosion of democracy by actions taken in secret by a small group of men safe from the scrutiny of public opinion. The media, in a country priding itself on its level of education and information, kept the public informed only on the most superficial level. The limits of Democratic Party criticism of the affair were revealed by a leading Democrat, Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, who, as the investigation was getting underway, said, "We must, all of us, help the president restore his credibility in foreign affairs." A few Democrats were critical, which was deplored by a Harvard professor, James Q. Wilson, who was a member of Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Wilson looked back nostalgically to a bipartisan consensus, the equivalent of the one-party system in a totalitarian state. He worried most about a lack of resolve to act like a great power. It became clear that President Reagan and Vice President Bush were involved in what became known as the Iran-Contra affair, but their underlings scrupulously kept them out of it, illustrating the familiar government device of plausible denial, in which the top official, shielded by subordinates, can plausibly deny involvement. Although Congressman Henry Gonzalez of Texas introduced a resolution for the impeachment of Reagan, it was quickly suppressed in Congress. Neither Reagan nor Bush were indicted. Rather, the Congressional Committee put the lesser culprits on the witness stand, and several of them were indicted. One, Robert McFarlane, a former national security advisor to Reagan, tried to commit suicide. Another, Colonel Oliver North, stood trial for lying to Congress, was found guilty, but was not sentenced to prison. Reagan retired in peace, and Bush became the next president of the United States. In an ironic twist, an obscure citizen of the tiny town of Odin, Indiana, became a tangential actor in the Iran-Contra controversy. This was a young man named Bill Breeden, a former minister who lived in a teepee in the woods with his wife and 2 children, teaching the children at home. Breeden's hometown of Odin was also the hometown of Admiral John Poindexter, McFarlane's successor as Reagan's national security advisor, who was heavily involved in the illegal activities of the Iran-Contra affair. One day, Bill Breeden noticed that the town, to show its pride in its homeboy, had renamed one of its streets John Poindexter Street. Breeden, a pacifist and critic of U.S. foreign policy, indignant at what he thought was a celebration of immoral behavior in government, stole the sign. He announced that he was holding it ransom, $30 million, the amount of money that had been given to Iran for transfer to the Contras. He was apprehended, put on trial, and spent a few days in jail. As it turned out, Bill Breeden was the only person to be imprisoned as a result of the Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra affair was only one of the many instances in which the government of the United States violated its own laws in pursuit of some desired goal in foreign policy. Toward the end of the Vietnam War in 1973, Congress, seeking to limit the presidential power that had been used so ruthlessly in Indochina, passed the War Powers Act, which said, "The President, in every possible instance, shall consult with Congress before introducing United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances." Almost immediately, President Gerald Ford violated the act when he ordered the invasion of a Cambodian island and the bombing of the Cambodian town, in retaliation for the temporary detention of American merchant seamen on the ship Mayaguez. He did not consult Congress before he gave the attack orders. In the fall of 1982, President Reagan sent American Marines into a dangerous situation in Lebanon, where a civil war was raging, again ignoring the requirements of the War Powers Act. The following year, over 200 of those Marines were killed when a bomb was exploded in their barracks by terrorists. Shortly after that, in October 1983, with some analysts concluding this was done to take attention away from the Lebanon disaster, Reagan sent U.S. forces to invade the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada. Again, Congress was notified, but not consulted. The reasons given to the American people for this invasion, officially called Operation Urgent Fury, were that a recent coup that had taken place in Grenada put American citizens, students at a medical school on the island, in danger, and that the United States had received an urgent request from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to intervene. An unusually pointed article in the New York Times on October 29, 1983, by correspondent Bernard Gwertzman, demolished those reasons. The formal request that the U.S. and other friendly countries provide military help was made by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States last Sunday at the request of the United States, which wanted to show proof that it had been requested to act under terms of that group's treaty. The wording of the formal request, however, was drafted in Washington and conveyed to the Caribbean leaders by special American emissaries. Both Cuba and Grenada, when they saw that American ships were heading for Grenada, sent urgent messages promising that American students were safe and urging that an invasion not occur. There is no indication that the administration made a determined effort to evacuate the Americans peacefully. Officials have acknowledged that there was no inclination to try to negotiate with the Grenadian authorities. "We got there just in time," the president said. "A major point in the dispute is whether, in fact, the Americans on the island were in such danger as to warrant an invasion. No official has produced firm evidence that the Americans were being mistreated or that they should not be able to leave if they wanted." The real reason for the invasion, one high American official told Gwertzman, was that the United States should show, determined to overcome the sense of defeat in Vietnam, that it was a truly powerful nation. What good are maneuvers and shows of force if you never use it? The connection between U.S. military intervention and the promotion of capitalist enterprise had always been especially crass in the Caribbean. As for Grenada, an article in the Wall Street Journal 8 years after the military invasion, October 29, 1991, spoke of an invasion of banks and noted that St. George's, the capital of Grenada, with 7,500 people, had 118 offshore banks, one for every 64 residents. St. George's has become the Casablanca of the Caribbean, a fast-growing haven for money laundering, tax evasion, and assorted financial fraud. After a study of various U.S. military interventions, political scientist Stephen Shalom, Imperial Alibis, concluded that people in the invaded countries died not to save U.S. nationals, who would have been far safer without U.S. intervention, but so that Washington might make clear that it ruled the Caribbean and that it was prepared to engage in a paroxysm of violence to enforce its will. He continued, there have been some cases where American citizens were truly in danger. For example, the 4 churchwomen who were killed by the government-sponsored death squads in El Salvador in 1980. But there was no U.S. intervention there, no marine landings, no protective bombing raids. Instead, Washington backed the death squad regime with military and economic aid, military training, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic support. The historic role of the United States in El Salvador, where 2% of the population owned 60% of the land, was to make sure governments were in power that would support U.S. business interests, no matter how this impoverished the great majority of people. Popular rebellions that would threaten these business arrangements were to be opposed. When a popular uprising in 1932 threatened the military government, the United States sent a cruiser and 2 destroyers to stand by, while the government massacred 30,000 Salvadorans. The administration of Jimmy Carter did nothing to reverse this history. It wanted reform in Latin America, but not revolution that would threaten U.S. corporate interests. In 1980, Richard Cooper, a State Department expert on economic affairs, told Congress that a more equitable distribution of wealth was desirable. However, we also have an enormous stake in the continuing smooth functioning in the economic system. Major changes in the system can have important implications for our own welfare. In February 1980, El Salvador Catholic Archbishop Oscar Romero sent a personal letter to President Carter asking him to stop military aid to El Salvador. Not long before that, the National Guard and National Police had opened fire on a crowd of protesters. Not long before that, the National Guard and National Police had opened fire on a crowd of protesters in front of the Metropolitan Cathedral and killed 24 people. But the Carter administration continued the aid. The following month, Archbishop Romero was assassinated. There was mounting evidence that the assassination had been ordered by Roberto d'Aubuisson, a leader of the right wing. But d'Aubuisson had the protection of Nicolas Carranza, a deputy minister of defense, who at the time was receiving $90,000 a year from the CIA. And Elliot Abrams, ironically Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, declared that d'Aubuisson was not involved in the murder. When Reagan became president, military aid to the El Salvador government rose steeply. From 1946 to 1979, total military aid to El Salvador was $16.7 million. In Reagan's first year in office, the figure rose to $82 million. Congress was sufficiently embarrassed by the killings in El Salvador to require that before any more aid was given, the president must certify that progress in human rights was taking place. Reagan did not take this seriously. On January 28, 1982, there were reports of a government massacre of peasants in several villages. The following day, Reagan certified that the Salvadoran government was making progress in human rights. 3 days after certification, soldiers stormed the homes of poor people in San Salvador, dragged out 20 people, and killed them. When at the end of 1983, Congress passed a law to continue the requirement of certification, Reagan vetoed it. The press was especially timid and obsequious during the Reagan years. As Mark Hertstad documents in his book, On Bended Knee, when journalist Raymond Bonner continued to report on the atrocities in El Salvador and on the U.S. role, the New York Times removed him from his assignment. Back in 1981, Bonner had reported on the massacre of hundreds of civilians in the town of El Mozote by a battalion of soldiers trained by the United States. The Reagan administration scoffed at the account. But in 1992, a team of forensic anthropologists began unearthing skeletons from the site of the massacre, most of them children. The following year, a UN commission confirmed the story of the massacre at El Mozote. The Reagan administration, which did not appear at all offended by military juntas governing in Latin America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, if they were friendly to the United States, became very upset when a tyranny was hostile, as was the government of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. In 1986, when unknown terrorists bombed a discotheque in West Berlin, killing a U.S. serviceman, the White House immediately decided to retaliate. Gaddafi was probably responsible for various acts of terrorism over the years, but there was no real evidence that in this case he was to blame. Reagan was determined to make a point. Planes were sent over the capital city of Tripoli with specific instructions to aim at Gaddafi's house. The bombs fell on a crowded city. Perhaps 100 people were killed. It was estimated by foreign diplomats in Tripoli. Gaddafi was not injured, but an adopted daughter of his was killed. Professor Stephen Shalom, analyzing this incident, writes, Imperial Alibis, if terrorism is defined as politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets, then one of the most serious incidents of international terrorism of the year was precisely this U.S. raid on Libya. Early in the presidency of George Bush, there came the most dramatic developments on the international scene since the end of World War II. In the year 1989, with a dynamic new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, at the head of the Soviet Union, the long-suppressed dissatisfaction with dictatorships of the proletariat, which had turned out to be dictatorships over the proletariat, erupted all through the Soviet bloc. There were mass demonstrations in the Soviet Union and in the countries of Eastern Europe, which had been long dominated by the Soviet Union. East Germany agreed to unite with West Germany, and the wall separating East Berlin from West Berlin, long a symbol of the tight control of its citizens by East Germany, was dismantled in the presence of wildly exultant citizens of both Germanys. In Czechoslovakia, a new non-communist government came into being, headed by a playwright and former imprisoned dissident named Václav Havel. In Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, a new leadership emerged, promising freedom and democracy. And remarkably, all this took place without civil war, in response to overwhelming popular demand. In the United States, the Republican Party claimed that the hardline policies of Reagan and the increase in military expenditures had brought down the Soviet Union. But the change had begun much earlier, after the death of Stalin in 1953, and especially with the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. A remarkably open discussion had been initiated. But the continued hard line of the United States became an obstacle to further liberalization, according to former ambassador to the Soviet Union, George Kennan, who wrote that the general effect of Cold War extremism was to delay rather than hasten the great change that overtook the Soviet Union by the end of the 1980s. While the press and politicians in the United States exulted over the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kennan pointed out that not only did American policies delay this collapse, but these Cold War policies were carried on at a frightful cost to the American people. We paid with 40 years of enormous and otherwise unnecessary military expenditures. We paid through the cultivation of nuclear weaponry to the point where the vast and useless nuclear arsenal had become, and remains today, a danger to the very environment of the planet. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union left the political leadership of the United States unprepared. Military interventions had been undertaken in Korea and Vietnam with enormous loss of life, also in Cuba and the Dominican Republic, and huge amounts of military aid had been given all over the world. In Europe, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, on the supposition that this was necessary to deal with a communist menace emanating from the Soviet Union. Several $1 trillion had been taken from American citizens in the form of taxes to maintain a huge nuclear and non-nuclear arsenal and military bases all over the world, all primarily justified by the Soviet threat. Here then was an opportunity for the United States to reconstruct its foreign policy and to free hundreds of billions of dollars a year from the budget to be used for constructive, healthy projects. But this did not happen. Along with the exultation, we have won the Cold War, came a kind of panic. What can we do to maintain our military establishment? It became clearer now, although it had been suspected, that United States foreign policy was not simply based on the existence of the Soviet Union, but was motivated by fear of revolution in various parts of the world. The radical social critic Noam Chomsky had long maintained that the appeal to security was largely fraudulent, the Cold War framework having been employed as a device to justify the suppression of independent nationalism, whether in Europe, Japan, or the Third World, world orders old and new. The fear of independent nationalism was that this would jeopardize powerful American economic interests. Revolutions in Nicaragua or Cuba or El Salvador or Chile, or threats to United Fruit, Anaconda Copper, International Telephone and Telegraph, and others. Thus, foreign interventions presented to the public as in the national interest were really undertaken for special interests, for which the American people were asked to sacrifice their sons and their tax dollars. The CIA now had to prove it was still needed. The New York Times, February 4, 1992, declared that, in a world where the post-war enemy has ceased to exist, the CIA and its handful of sister agencies with their billion-dollar satellites and mountains of classified documents must somehow remain relevant in the minds of Americans. The military budget remained huge. The Cold War budget of $300 billion was reduced by 7% to $280 billion. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, said, "I want to scare the hell out of the rest of the world. I don't say that in a bellicose way." As if to prove that the gigantic military establishment was still necessary, the Bush administration in its 4-year term launched 2 wars, a small one against Panama and a massive one against Iraq. Coming into office in 1989, George Bush was embarrassed by the new defiant posture of Panama's dictator, General Manuel Noriega. Noriega's regime was corrupt, brutal, authoritarian. But President Reagan and Vice President Bush had overlooked this because Noriega was useful to the United States. He cooperated with the CIA in many ways, such as offering Panama as a base for Contra operations against the Sandinista government of Nicaragua, and meeting with Colonel Oliver North to discuss sabotage targets in Nicaragua. When he was director of the CIA in 1976-1977, Bush had protected Noriega. But by 1987, Noriega's usefulness was over. His activities in the drug trade were in the open, and he became a convenient target for an administration which wanted to prove that the United States, apparently unable to destroy the Castro regime or the Sandinistas or the revolutionary movement in El Salvador, was still a power in the Caribbean. Claiming that it wanted to bring Noriega to trial as a drug trafficker, he had been indicted in Florida on that charge, and also that it needed to protect U.S. citizens. A military man and his wife had been threatened by Panamanian soldiers. The United States invaded Panama in December 1989 with 26,000 troops. It was a quick victory. Noriega was captured and brought to Florida to stand trial, where he was subsequently found guilty and sent to prison. But in the invasion, neighborhoods in Panama City were bombarded and hundreds, perhaps thousands of civilians were killed. It was estimated that 14,000 were homeless. Writer Mark Hertsgaard noted that even if the official Pentagon figure of several hundred civilian casualties was correct, this meant that in Panama, the U.S. had killed as many people as did the Chinese government in its notorious attack on student demonstrators at Tiananmen Square in Beijing 6 months earlier. A new president friendly to the United States was installed in Panama, but poverty and unemployment remained. And in 1992, the New York Times reported that the invasion and removal of Noriega failed to stanch the flow of illicit narcotics through Panama. The United States, however, succeeded in one of its aims, to re-establish its strong influence over Panama. The Times reported, "The President of Panama and his key aides and the American ambassador, Dean Hinton, have breakfast together once a week in a meeting that many Panamanians view as the place where important decisions are taken." Liberal Democrats, John Kerry and Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, and many others, declared their support of the military action. The Democrats were being true to their historic role as supporters of military intervention, anxious to show that foreign policy was bipartisan. They seemed determined to show they were as tough or as ruthless as the Republicans. But the Panama operation was on too small a scale to accomplish what both the Reagan and Bush administrations badly wanted: to overcome the American public's abhorrence since Vietnam of foreign military interventions. 2 years later, the Gulf War against Iraq presented such an opportunity. Iraq, under the brutal dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, had taken over its small but oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait, in August 1990. George Bush needed something at this point to boost his popularity among American voters. The Washington Post, October 16, 1990, had a front-page story headline: "Poll shows plunge in public confidence. Bush's rating plummets." The Post reported, October 28, "Some observers in his own party worry that the president will be forced to initiate combat to prevent further erosion of his support at home." On October 30th, a secret decision was made for war in Iraq. The United Nations had responded to the invasion of Kuwait by establishing sanctions against Iraq. Witness after witness testified before congressional committees in the fall of 1990 that the sanctions were having an effect and should continue. Secret CIA testimony to the Senate affirmed that Iraq's imports and exports had been reduced by more than 90% because of the sanctions. But after the November elections brought gains for the Democrats in Congress, Bush doubled American military forces in the Gulf to 500,000, creating what was now clearly an offensive force rather than a defensive one. According to Elizabeth Drew, a writer for The New Yorker, Bush's aide, John Sununu, was telling people that a short, successful war would be pure political gold for the president and would guarantee his re-election. Historian John Wiener, analyzing the domestic context of the war decision shortly afterward, wrote that Bush abandoned sanctions and chose war because his time frame was a political one set up by the approaching 1992 presidential elections. That and the long-time U.S. wish to have a decisive voice in the control of Middle East oil resources were the crucial elements in the decision to go to war against Iraq. Shortly after the war, as representatives of the 13 oil-producing nations were about to gather in Geneva, the business correspondent of the New York Times wrote, "By virtue of its military victory, the United States is likely to have more influence in the organization of petroleum exporting countries than any industrial nation has ever exercised." But those motives were not presented to the American public. It was told that the United States wanted to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi control. The major media dwelled on this as a reason for war, without noting that other countries had been invaded without the United States showing such concern. East Timor by Indonesia, Iran by Iraq, Lebanon by Israel, Mozambique by South Africa, to say nothing of countries invaded by the United States itself. Grenada, Panama. The justification for war that seemed most compelling was that Iraq was on its way to building a nuclear bomb. But the evidence for this was very weak. Before the crisis over Kuwait, Western intelligence sources had estimated it would take Iraq 3 to 10 years to build a nuclear weapon. Even if Iraq could build a bomb in a year or two, which was the most pessimistic estimate, it had no delivery system to send it anywhere. Besides, Israel already had nuclear weapons, and the United States had perhaps 30,000 of them. The Bush administration was trying hard to develop a paranoia in the nation about an Iraqi bomb, which did not yet exist. Bush seemed determined to go to war. There had been several chances to negotiate an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait right after the invasion, including an Iraqi proposal reported on August 29 by Newsday correspondent Newt Royce. But there was no response from the United States. When Secretary of State James Baker went to Geneva to meet with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, the instruction from Bush was no negotiations. Despite months of exhortation from Washington about the dangers of Saddam Hussein, surveys showed that less than half of the public favored military action. In January 1991, Bush, apparently feeling the need for support, asked Congress to give him the authority to make war. This was not a declaration of war, as called for by the Constitution, but since Korea and Vietnam, that provision of the Constitution seemed dead, and even the strict constructionists on the Supreme Court, who prided themselves on taking the words of the Constitution literally and seriously, would not intervene. The debate in Congress was lively. At one point, a Senate speech was interrupted by protesters in the balcony shouting, "No blood for oil." The protesters were hustled out by guards. It is likely that Bush was sure of having enough votes, or he would have launched the invasion without congressional approval. After all, the precedent for ignoring Congress and the Constitution had been set in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, and Panama. The Senate voted for military action by only a few votes. The House supported the resolution by a larger majority. However, once Bush ordered the attack on Iraq, both houses, with just a few dissents, Democrats as well as Republicans, voted to support the war and support the troops. It was in mid-January 1991, after Saddam Hussein defied an ultimatum to leave Kuwait, that the U.S. launched its air war against Iraq. It was given the name Desert Storm. The government and the media had conjured up a picture of a formidable military power, but Iraq was far from that. The U.S. Air Force had total control of the air and could bomb at will. Not only that, U.S. officials had virtual total control of the airwaves. The American public was overwhelmed with television photos of smart bombs and confident statements that laser bombs were being guided with perfect precision to military targets. The major networks presented all of these claims without question or criticism. This confidence in smart bombs sparing civilians may have contributed to a shift in public opinion from being equally divided on going to war to perhaps 85% support for the invasion. Perhaps more important in winning over public support was that once American military were engaged, it seemed to many people who had previously opposed military action that to criticize it now meant betraying the troops who were there. All over the nation, yellow ribbons were displayed as a symbol of support for the forces in Iraq. In fact, the public was being deceived about how smart the bombs being dropped on Iraqi towns were. After talking with former intelligence and Air Force officers, a correspondent for the Boston Globe reported that perhaps 40% of the laser-guided bombs dropped in Operation Desert Storm missed their targets. John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy under President Reagan, estimated there had been thousands of civilian casualties. The Pentagon officially had no figure on this. A senior Pentagon official told the Globe, "To tell you the truth, we're not really focusing on this question." A Reuters dispatch from Iraq described the destruction of a 73-room hotel in a town south of Baghdad and quoted an Egyptian witness. They hit the hotel full of families, and then they came back to hit it again. Reuters reported that the air raids on Iraq first used laser-guided bombs, but within a few weeks turned to B-52s, which carried conventional bombs, meaning more indiscriminate bombing. American reporters were kept from seeing the war close up, and their dispatches were subject to censorship. Apparently recalling how press reports of civilian casualties had affected public opinion during the Vietnam War, the U.S. government was taking no chances this time. A Washington Post reporter complained about the control of information, writing in January 22, 1991. The bombing has involved dozens of high-flying B-52 bombers equipped with huge unguided munitions. But the Pentagon has not allowed interviews with B-52 pilots, shown videotapes of their actions, or answered any questions about the operations of an aircraft that is the most deadly and least accurate in the armada of more than 2,000 U.S. and Allied planes in the Persian Gulf region. In mid-February, U.S. planes dropped bombs on an air raid shelter in Baghdad at 4 in the morning, killing 400 to 500 people. An Associated Press reporter, who was one of the few allowed to go to the site, said, "Most of the recovered bodies were charred and mutilated beyond recognition. Some, clearly, were children." The Pentagon claimed it was a military target, but the AP reporter on the scene said, "No evidence of any military presence could be seen inside the wreckage." Other reporters who inspected the site agreed. After the war, 15 Washington News Bureau chiefs complained in a joint statement that the Pentagon exercised virtual total control over the American press during the Gulf War. But while it was happening, leading television news commentators behaved as if they were working for the United States government. For instance, CBS correspondent Dan Rather, perhaps the most widely seen of the TV newsmen, reported from Saudi Arabia on a film showing a laser bomb, this one dropped by British aircraft in support of the American war, hitting a marketplace and killing civilians. Rather's only comment was, "We can be sure that Saddam Hussein will make propaganda of these casualties." When the Soviet government tried to negotiate an end to the war, bringing Iraq out of Kuwait before the ground war could get underway, top CBS correspondent Leslie Stahl asked another reporter, "Isn't this the nightmare scenario? Aren't the Soviets trying to stop us?" Ed Siegel, TV reporter for the Boston Globe, February 23, 1991. The final stage of the war, barely 6 weeks after it had begun, was a ground assault which, like the air war, encountered virtually no resistance. With victory certain and the Iraqi army in full flight, U.S. planes kept bombing the retreating soldiers, who clogged the highway out of Kuwait City. A reporter called the scene a blazing hell, a gruesome testament. To the east and west, across the sand, lay the bodies of those fleeing. A Yale professor of military history, Michael Howard, writing in the New York Times, January 28, 1991, quoted the military strategist Clausewitz approvingly. "The fact that a bloody slaughter is a horrifying act must make us take war more seriously, but not provide an excuse for gradually blunting our swords in the name of humanity." Howard went on to say, "In this conflict of wills, the bottom line remains a readiness to kill and be killed." The human consequences of the war became shockingly clear after its end, when it was revealed that the bombings of Iraq had caused starvation, disease, and the deaths of tens of thousands of children. A UN team visiting Iraq immediately after the war reported that the recent conflict has wrought near apocalyptic results upon the infrastructure. Most means of modern life support have been destroyed or rendered tenuous. A Harvard medical team reporting in May said that child mortality had risen steeply and that 55,000 more children died in the first 4 months of the year, the war lasted from January 15 to February 28, than in a comparable period the year before. The director of a pediatric hospital in Baghdad told a New York Times reporter that on the first night of the bombing campaign, the electricity was knocked out. Mothers grabbed their children out of incubators, took intravenous tubes out of their arms. Others were removed from oxygen tents and they ran to the basement where there was no heat. I lost more than 40 prematures in the first 12 hours of the bombing. Although in the course of the war, Saddam Hussein had been depicted by U.S. officials in the press as another Hitler, the war ended short of a march into Baghdad, leaving Hussein in power. It seemed that the United States had wanted to weaken him, but not to eliminate him, in order to keep him as a balance against Iran. In the years before the Gulf War, the United States had sold arms to both Iran and Iraq, at different times favoring one or the other as part of the traditional balance of power strategy. Therefore, as the war ended, the United States did not support Iraqi dissidents who wanted to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein. A New York Times dispatch from Washington, datelined March 26, 1991, reported, President Bush has decided to let President Saddam Hussein put down rebellions in his country without American intervention, rather than risk the splintering of Iraq, according to official statements and private briefings today. This left the Kurdish minority, which was rebelling against Saddam Hussein, helpless. And anti-Hussein elements among the Iraqi majority were also left hanging. The Washington Post reported, May 3, 1991, major defections from the Iraqi military were in the offing in March at the height of the Kurdish rebellion, but never materialized because the officers concluded the U.S. would not back the uprising. The man who had been Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a month after the end of the Gulf War, gave a cold assessment of the pluses and minuses of the event. The benefits are undeniably impressive. First, a blatant act of aggression was rebuffed and punished. Second, U.S. military power is henceforth likely to be taken more seriously. Third, the Middle East and Persian Gulf region is now clearly an American sphere of preponderance. Brzezinski, however, was concerned about some negative consequences. One of them was that the very intensity of the air assault on Iraq gives rise to concern that the conduct of the war may come to be seen as evidence that Americans view Arab lives as worthless, and that raises the moral question of the proportionality of response. His point about Arab lives being seen as worthless was underlined by the fact that the war provoked an ugly wave of anti-Arab racism in the United States, with Arab Americans insulted or beaten or threatened with death. There were bumper stickers that said, "I don't break for Iraqis." An Arab American businessman was beaten in Toledo, Ohio. Brzezinski's measured assessment of the Gulf War could be taken as close to representing the view of the Democratic Party. It went along with the Bush administration. It was pleased with the results. It had some misgivings about civilian casualties, but it did not constitute an opposition. President George Bush was satisfied. As the war ended, he declared on a radio broadcast, "The specter of Vietnam has been buried forever in the desert sands of the Arabian Peninsula." The establishment press very much agreed. The two leading news magazines, Time and Newsweek, had special editions hailing the victory in the war, noting there had been only a few hundred American casualties, without any mention of Iraqi casualties. A New York Times editorial, March 30th, 1991, said, "Americans' victory in the Persian Gulf War provided special vindication for the U.S. Army, which brilliantly exploited its firepower and mobility, and in the process erased memories of its grievous difficulties in Vietnam." A black poet in Berkeley, California, June Jordan, had a different view. "I suggest to you it's a hit the same way that crack is, and it doesn't last long." Chapter 22, The Unreported Resistance. In the early 1990s, a writer for the New Republic magazine, reviewing with approval in the New York Times a book about the influence of dangerously unpatriotic elements among American intellectuals, warned his readers of the existence of a permanent adversarial culture in the United States. It was an accurate observation. Despite the political consensus of Democrats and Republicans in Washington, which set limits on American reform, making sure that capitalism was in place, that national military strength was maintained, that wealth and power remained in the hands of a few, there were millions of Americans, probably tens of millions, who refused, either actively or silently, to go along. Their activities were largely unreported by the media. They constituted this permanent adversarial culture. The Democratic Party was more responsive to these Americans, on whose votes it depended. But its responsiveness was limited by its own captivity to corporate interests, and its domestic reforms were severely limited by the system's dependency on militarism and war. Thus, President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty in the 60s became a victim of the war in Vietnam, and Jimmy Carter could not go far so long as he insisted on a huge outlay of money for the military, much of this to stockpile more nuclear weapons. As these limits became clear in the Carter years, a small but determined movement against nuclear arms began to grow. The pioneers were a tiny group of Christian pacifists who had been active against the Vietnam War. Among them were a former priest, Philip Berrigan, and his wife, Elizabeth McAllister, a former nun. Again and again, members of this group would be arrested for engaging in nonviolent acts of dramatic protest against nuclear war at the Pentagon and the White House, trespassing on forbidden areas, pouring their own blood on symbols of the war machine. In 1980, small delegations of peace activists from all over the country maintained a series of demonstrations at the Pentagon, in which over 1,000 people were arrested for acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. In September of that year, Philip Berrigan, his brother Daniel, the Jesuit priest and poet, Molly Rush, a mother of 6, Anne Montgomery, a nun and counselor to young runaways and prostitutes in Manhattan, and 4 of their friends made their way past a guard in the General Electric plant at King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, where nose cones for nuclear missiles were manufactured. They used sledgehammers to smash 2 of the nose cones and smeared their own blood over missile parts, blueprints, and furniture. Arrested, sentenced to years in prison, they said they were trying to set an example to do as the Bible suggested, to beat swords into plowshares. They pointed to the huge allocations of taxpayers' money to corporations producing weaponry. GE drains $3 million a day from the public treasury, an enormous larceny against the poor. Before their trial, they came to be known as the Plowshares 8. Daniel Berrigan had written in the Catholic Worker, "I know of no sure way of predicting where things will go from there, whether others will hear and respond, or how quickly or slowly, or whether the act will fail to vitalize others, will come to a grinding halt then and there, its actors stigmatized or dismissed as fools. One swallows dry and takes a chance." In fact, the movement did not come to a halt. Over the next decade, a national movement against nuclear weapons developed. From a small number of men and women willing to go to jail to make others stop and think, to millions of Americans frightened at the thought of nuclear holocaust, indignant at the billions of dollars spent on weaponry, while people were in need of life's necessities. Even the very middle American Pennsylvania jurors who convicted the Plowshares 8 showed remarkable sympathy with their actions. One juror, Michael DeRosa, told a reporter, "I didn't think they really went to commit a crime. They went to protest." Another, Mary Ann Ingram, said, "The jury argued about that. We really didn't want to convict them on anything, but we had to because of the way the judge said the thing you can use is what you get under the law." She added, "These people are not criminals. Here are people who are trying to do some good for the country." But the judge said nuclear power wasn't the issue. Reagan's huge military budget was to provoke a national movement against nuclear weapons. In the election of 1980 that brought him into the presidency, local referenda in 3 districts in western Massachusetts permitted voters to say whether they believed in a mutual Soviet-American halt to testing, production, and deployment of all nuclear weapons, and wanted Congress to devote those funds instead to civilian use. 2 peace groups had worked for months on the campaign, and all 3 districts approved the resolution, 94,000 to 65,000, even those that voted for Reagan as president. Similar referenda received majority votes between 1978 and 1981 in San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, Madison, and Detroit. Women were in the forefront of the new anti-nuclear movement. Randall Forsberg, a young specialist in nuclear arms, organized the Council for a Nuclear Weapons Freeze, whose simple program, a mutual Soviet-American freeze on the production of new nuclear weapons, began to catch on throughout the country. Shortly after Reagan's election, 2,000 women assembled in Washington, marched on the Pentagon, and surrounded it in a great circle, linking arms or stretching to hold the ends of brightly colored scarves. 140 women were arrested for blocking the Pentagon entrance. A small group of doctors began to organize meetings around the country to teach citizens the medical consequences of nuclear war. They were the core of the Physicians for Social Responsibility, and Dr. Helen Caldicott, the group's president, became one of the most powerful and eloquent national leaders of the movement. At one of their public symposia, Howard Hyatt, dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, gave a graphic description of the results of one 20-megaton nuclear bomb falling on Boston. 2 million people would die. Survivors would be burned, blinded, crippled. In a nuclear war, there would be 25 million severe burn cases in the nation, yet all existing facilities could care for only 200 cases. At a national meeting of Catholic bishops early in the Reagan administration, the majority opposed any use of nuclear weapons. In November 1981, there were meetings on 151 college campuses around the country on the issue of nuclear war. And at local elections in Boston that month, a resolution calling for increased federal spending on social programs by reducing the amount of our tax dollars spent on nuclear weapons and programs of foreign intervention, won a majority in every one of Boston's 22 wards, including both white and black working-class districts. On June 12, 1982, the largest political demonstration in the history of the country took place in Central Park, New York City. Close to 1 million people gathered to express their determination to bring an end to the arms race. Scientists who had worked on the atom bomb added their voices to the growing movement. George Kistiakowsky, a Harvard University chemistry professor who had worked on the first atomic bomb and later was science advisor to President Eisenhower, became a spokesman for the disarmament movement. His last public remarks before his death from cancer at the age of 82 were in an editorial for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in December 1982. I tell you as my parting words, forget the channels. There simply is not enough time left before the world explodes. Concentrate instead on organizing with so many others of like mind, a mass movement for peace such as there has not been before. By the spring of 1983, the nuclear freeze had been endorsed by 368 city and county councils across the country, by 444 town meetings and 17 state legislatures, and by the House of Representatives. A Harris poll at this time indicated that 79% of the population wanted a nuclear freeze agreement with the Soviet Union. Even among evangelical Christians, a group of 40 million people presumed to be conservative and pro-Reagan, a Gallup poll sampling showed 60% favoring a nuclear freeze. A year after the Great Central Park demonstration, there were over 3,000 anti-war groups around the country, and the anti-nuclear feeling was being reflected in the culture. In books, magazine articles, plays, motion pictures. Jonathan Schell's impassioned book against the arms race, The Fate of the Earth, became a national bestseller. a documentary film on the arms race made in Canada, was forbidden to enter the country by the Reagan administration, but a federal court ordered it admitted. In less than 3 years, there had come about a remarkable change in public opinion. At the time of Reagan's election, nationalist feeling, drummed up by the recent hostage crisis in Iran and by the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, was strong. The University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center found that only 12% of those polled thought too much was being spent on arms. But when it took another poll in the spring of 1982, that figure rose to 32%. And in the spring of 1983, a New York Times CBS News poll found that the figure had risen again to 48%. Anti-militarist feeling expressed itself also in resistance to the draft. When President Jimmy Carter, responding to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, called for the registration of young men for a military draft, more than 800,000 men, 10%, failed to register. One mother wrote to the New York Times, "To the editor, 36 years ago, I stood in front of the crematorium. The ugliest force in the world had promised itself that I should be removed from the cycle of life, that I should never know the pleasure of giving life. With great guns and great hatred, this force thought itself the equal of the force of life. I survived the great guns, and with every smile of my son, they grow smaller. It is not for me, sir, to offer my son's blood as lubricant for the next generation of guns. I remove myself and my own from the cycle of death." Isabella Lightner. Former Nixon aide Alexander Haig warned in an interview in the French journal Politique Internationale that there might reappear in the U.S. the conditions that forced President Nixon to stop the draft. "There is a Jane Fonda on every doorstep," he said. One of the young men who refused to register, James Peters, wrote an open letter to President Carter. "Dear Mr. President, on July 23, 1980, I am expected to report to my local post office for the purpose of registering with the Selective Service System. I hereby inform you, Mr. President, that I will not register on July 23rd or at any time thereafter. We have tried militarism, and it has failed the human race in every way imaginable." Once he was in office, Ronald Reagan hesitated to renew draft registration because, as his Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger explained, President Reagan believes that resuming the draft to meet manpower problems would lead to public unrest comparable to that in the 60s and 70s. William Beecher, a former Pentagon reporter, wrote in November 1981 that Reagan was obviously concerned, even alarmed by the mounting voices of discontent and suspicion over emerging U.S. nuclear strategy both in the streets of Europe and more recently on American campuses. Hoping to intimidate this opposition, the Reagan administration began to prosecute draft resistors. One of those facing prison was Benjamin Sasway, who cited U.S. military intervention in El Salvador as a good reason not to register for the draft. Aroused by Sasway's civil disobedience, a right-wing columnist, William A. Rusher of the National Review, wrote indignantly that one heritage of the 60s was a new generation of anti-war teachers. Almost certainly there was a teacher or teachers who taught Benjamin Sasway to look at American society as a hypocritical, exploitative, materialistic roadblock on the path of human progress. The generation of the Vietnam protesters is now in its early 30s, and the academicians among them are already ensconced in the faculties of the country's high schools and colleges. What a pity our jurisprudence doesn't allow us to reach and penalize the real architects of this sort of destruction. Reagan's policy of giving military aid to the dictatorship of El Salvador was not accepted quietly around the nation. He had barely taken office when the following report appeared in the Boston Globe. It was a scene reminiscent of the 60s, a rally of students in Harvard Yard shouting anti-war slogans, a candlelight march through the streets of Cambridge, 2,000 persons, mostly students, gathered to protest U.S. involvement in El Salvador. Students from Tufts, MIT, Boston University and Boston College, the University of Massachusetts, Brandeis, Suffolk, Dartmouth, Northeastern, Vassar, Yale, and Simmons were represented. During commencement exercises that spring of 1981 at Syracuse University, when Reagan's Secretary of State Alexander Haig was given an honorary doctorate in public service, 200 students and faculty turned their backs on the presentation. During Haig's address, the press reported, nearly every pause in Mr. Haig's 15-minute address was punctuated by chants. Human needs, not military greed. Get out of El Salvador. Washington guns killed American nuns. The last slogan was a reference to the execution in the fall of 1980 of 4 American nuns by Salvadoran soldiers. Thousands of people in El Salvador were being murdered each year by death squads, sponsored by a government armed by the United States, and the American public was beginning to pay attention to events in this tiny Central American country. As has been true generally in the making of U.S. foreign policy, there was no pretense at democracy. Public opinion was simply ignored. A New York Times CBS News poll in the spring of 1982 reported that only 16% of its sampling favored Reagan's program of sending military and economic aid to El Salvador. In the spring of 1983, it was disclosed that an American physician named Charles Clement was working with the Salvadoran rebels. As an Air Force pilot in Southeast Asia, he had become disillusioned with U.S. policy there, having seen firsthand that his government was lying and refused to fly any more missions. The Air Force response was to commit him to a psychiatric hospital, then to discharge him as psychologically unfit. He went to medical school and then volunteered to be a doctor with the guerrillas in El Salvador. There was much talk in the American press in the early 80s about the political cautiousness of a new generation of college students, concerned mostly with their own careers. But when, at the Harvard commencement of June 1983, Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes criticized American intervention in Latin America and said, "Because we are your true friends, we will not permit you to conduct yourselves in Latin American affairs as the Soviet Union conducts itself in Central European and Central Asian affairs," he was interrupted 20 times by applause and received a standing ovation when finished. Among my own students at Boston University, I did not find the pervasive selfishness and unconcern with others that the media kept reporting in deadening repetition about the students of the 80s. In the journals they kept, I found the following comments. A male student: "Do you think anything good that has happened in the world had anything to do with government? I work in Roxbury, a black neighborhood. I know the government doesn't work. Not for the people of Roxbury, and not for the people anywhere. It works for people with money." A graduate of a Catholic high school: "America to me is a society, a culture. America is my home. If someone were to rob that culture from me, then perhaps there would be reason to resist. I will not die, however, to defend the honor of the government." A young woman: "As a white middle-class person, I've never felt discriminated against at all. But I'll say this, if anyone ever tried to make me sit in a different schoolroom, use a different bathroom, or anything like that, I would knock them right on their ass. The people are the last ones that need their rights stated on paper, for if they're abused or injustice by government or authority, they can act on the injustice directly. When you look at the statements of rights and laws, it's really government and authority and institutions and corporations that need laws and rights to insulate them from the physicality, the directness of the people." Beyond the campuses out in the country, there was opposition to government policy not widely known. A report from Tucson, Arizona, early in the Reagan presidency, described demonstrators, mainly middle-aged, protesting at the Federal Building against U.S. involvement in El Salvador. Over 1,000 people in Tucson marched in a procession and attended a mass to commemorate the anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who had spoken out against the Salvadoran death squads. Over 60,000 Americans signed pledges to take action of some sort, including civil disobedience, if Reagan moved to invade Nicaragua. When the president instituted a blockade of the tiny country to try to force its government out of power, there were demonstrations around the country. In Boston alone, 550 people were arrested protesting the blockade. During Reagan's presidency, there were hundreds of actions throughout the nation against his policies in South Africa. He obviously did not want to see the white ruling minority of South Africa displaced by the radical African National Congress, which represented the black majority. Chester Crocker, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, in his memoirs, called Reagan insensitive to the conditions under which blacks lived there. Public opinion was strong enough to cause Congress to legislate economic sanctions against the South African government in 1986, overriding Reagan's veto. Reagan's cuts in social services were felt on the local level as vital needs could not be taken care of, and there were angry reactions. In the spring and summer of 1981, residents of East Boston took to the streets. For 55 nights, they blocked major thoroughfares and the Sumner Tunnel during rush hour in order to protest cutbacks in funds for fire, police, and teachers. The police superintendent, John Doyle, said, "Maybe these people are starting to take lessons from the protests of the 60s and 70s. The Boston Globe reported, "The demonstrators in East Boston were mostly middle-aged, middle or working-class people who said they had never protested anything before." The Reagan administration took away federal funds for the arts, suggesting that the performing arts seek help from private donors. In New York, 2 historic Broadway theaters were razed to make way for a luxury 50-story hotel after 200 theater people demonstrated, picketing, reading plays and singing songs, refusing to disperse. In New York, 2 historic Broadway theaters were razed to make way for a luxury 50-story hotel after 200 theater people demonstrated, picketing, reading plays and singing songs, refusing to disperse when ordered by police. Some of the nation's best-known theater personalities were arrested, including producer Joseph Pack, actresses Tammy Grimes, Estelle Parsons, and Celeste Holm, actors Richard Gere and Michael Moriarty. The budget cuts spurred strikes across the country, often by groups unaccustomed to striking. In the fall of 1982, United Press International reported, "Angered by layoffs, salary cuts, and uncertainty about job security, more school teachers throughout the country have decided to go on strike. Teacher strikes last week in 7 states from Rhode Island to Washington have idled more than 300,000 students." Surveying a series of news events in the first week of January 1983, David Nyhan of the Boston Globe wrote, "There is something brewing in the land that bodes ill for those in Washington who ignore it. People have moved from the frightened state to the angry stage and are acting out their frustrations in ways that will test the fabric of civil order." He gave some examples. In Little Washington, Pennsylvania, in early 1983, when a 50-year-old computer science teacher who led a teacher strike was sent to jail, 2,000 people demonstrated outside the jailhouse in his support, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called it the largest crowd in Washington County since the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion, when unemployed or bankrupt homeowners in the Pittsburgh area could no longer make mortgage payments and foreclosure sales were scheduled. 60 pickets jammed the courthouse to protest the auction, and Allegheny Sheriff Eugene Kuhn halted the proceedings. The foreclosure of a 320-acre wheat farm in Springfield, Colorado, was interrupted by 200 angry farmers who had to be dispersed by tear gas and mace. When Reagan arrived in Pittsburgh in April 1983 to make a speech, 3,000 people, many of them unemployed steelworkers, demonstrated against him, standing in the rain outside his hotel